Thank you for joining us on the Think Safe podcast. My name is Scott O'Brien. I'm the Vice President of Operations with APB. And I want to talk to you about a very specific topic that is currently still on everybody's mind and has been for quite some time. Now, let me explain, and I want to kind of frame this up for you on indicators of workplace violence. And I know that's a term that everyone has heard for quite some time, and people say that they are watching it. In my experience, some organizations do better than others, but it is a very tough thing to kind of wrap your head around, because we have to ask ourselves, what is the difference between indicators of workplace violence and somebody just having a bad day? And the truth is in the middle. We have to be able to delineate how we do that. So there actually is, in my humble opinion, there is a process to do that. First of all, I want to say this. I want to make sure that one of the biggest questions that you ask, number one, of yourself, and number two, of your organization, is this: is there a way for you to actually report these indicators? Once I go through the indicators with you, and once I share with you, I'm going to share 12 of them with you. There could be more, there could be less. And then I'm also going to share with you a way to actually measure these. And I'll explain as we go. But one of the things I really want you to ask yourself, and then ask someone, whether it's a coworker or supervisor, is there a way for you to report these things? Now, some organizations have a wonderful system. They have a system where you can remain anonymous. They have a full written out plan. This goes, if the threat or the concerning behavior reaches a certain level, that it escalates to what would be called a behavioral threat assessment team, and they really start examining this. That is wonderful. That is outstanding. And there's actually a lot of things you can find out there on the internet that would help you do that. I recommend going through federal agencies rather than necessarily a private group. APB can help you understand that process, and we can give some guidance. But one of the things that you're going to see from this podcast that we're going to share is from a federal agency, and it's probably one of the best ways to measure those indicators that we're going to be talking about. And I would recommend that you at least look at it and maybe compare it to something that you already have in place at your work. So without further ado, let's talk about some of these indicators. The first thing I think you should have in place before you even start going down this road is there's two sides, there's two roads you need to cover. Number one is you need to educate your employees. You can't just assume that everybody understands what behavior changes are, and how that translates to potential workplace violence. So there has to be some form of education. The other side of that road is exactly what I just mentioned earlier, was you have to have a system in place for them to report it. There have been quite a few occasions where people have noticed something, and I'm not telling you anything you haven't already heard before on the internet or in the news, where there's been some type of active aggressor incident, a shooter, and post-event, someone comes out and says, oh, by the way, they said this to me. Oh, or by the way, they posted this on social media. Now, that is becoming a very real thing. In fact, I would argue, even from the time when I retired in 2017, we saw social media postings, but I think it's escalated up to today. I think a lot of these shooters are so tied into social media that that's the way they either put out their manifesto, or they express their concern or dislike of a group or an individual or an organization. It's all being blasted out on social media. Now, that does not mean that someone won't walk up to a coworker and say, hey, by the way, I'm really having a trouble with our boss, and this is what I think I'm going to do about it. That can still happen. In many cases, that does still happen. But either way, your employees have got to be educated on what that looks like and how you recognize those behaviors. So let's get into the 12 I want to talk about. Number one, and these are in no particular order. Please understand that. I'm just kind of going down a list. These are in no particular order. Resistance and overreaction to changes in policy and procedures. Now, we've all had that. I want everybody to understand not just one indicator means that somebody's going to come in and start shooting or start doing something disruptive. That's not the case. And this is where the education part comes in. You have to understand that it's the totality of what you're seeing. It's not just one particular thing, it's the totality of what you're seeing. Resistance to changes in policy. That to me is a small one, because we've all had that. A policy changes. Let's say, for example, I'm used to a 1 hour lunch break, and all of a sudden the policy's down to 30 minutes is what I have for lunch. Yeah, that's probably going to bother me a little bit. But again, it's one piece and one indicator. Number two, repeated violations of company policies. Now, this I will say you need to pay attention to. When most organizations have a pretty good set of policies, rules, procedures, whatever you want to call them, they have those in place, and they're in place for a reason. And when you have one particular person that seems to just not get it, and they just continue to violate and violate and violate those policies, that to me is a big indicator. Again, I'm not going to go down the road of saying that they're going to come in and start shooting, but what I will say is you better start paying attention to that person. And this is where you have a system in place, whether it's some type of disciplinary action that's taken or verbal counseling, whatever it may be. Number three, increased severe mood swings. Again, this can happen because someone just maybe is struggling with something personal. There are people that have legitimate mental health issues that doesn't mean that they're going to come in and cause chaos. But start recognizing that if I'm used to working with someone that's bright and cheery and smiling and joking and they're just a pleasure to be around, and then all of a sudden something changes. No, they are no longer a pleasure. They are no longer their jovial self at work. Pay attention to that. It may be nothing. It may just be, they might be having some financial constraints. Maybe they have a sick family member. But at the very least, you got to pay attention to it and start seeing, is this escalating, or is this going to just kind of work itself out just because they're having something personal in their life they're struggling with. Number four, noticeably unstable emotional responses. Now, that's a large field. That's there's a lot that can go under that statement. I think what I would like to recognize about that statement is this. If you understand certain people that you work with, and you understand and have worked with them a while, how their emotional response is. In other words, they have a particular baseline of emotion. And all of a sudden that baseline changes and their emotion erupts, or they become extremely depressed, and that's not their norm. Pay attention to that. Again, focus on, is this a common ground? Is it common for them to do this? Have they had some swings before in the past and everything's worked itself out, or is something drastic? What I do want to express to you is there have been some case studies done where particularly family members, their loved one has gone in and committed a heinous act at their workplace. They've shot people, they've killed, injured people. And the family has come back and said, you know what, we actually noticed this about this person, and they got even more specific during this period of time. Now, in my opinion, that is something that they should have taken note of much earlier. And yes, it's easy to say when you sit back and you examine and you study these things that, hey, somebody should have done this or somebody should have done that. But it's happened enough over the course of these active shootings that there's a trend there. There's a pattern. And I believe particularly that family members really need to pay attention to some of these last few that I've mentioned. Number five, explosive outburst or anger, rage without provocation. Again, That's some type of an emotional response. Now, some people wear their emotions on their sleeves. However, if you're not used to seeing that, and all of a sudden, John that I work with or Mary that I work with, all of a sudden just starts erupting. I mean, just in a rage. We understand the difference between being angry and going into a rage. That is, all of us can understand the difference there. Why is that happening? You ask yourself, why is that happening? A lot of this too, I do want to make this point before I move on to the next one. Organizations can also be there to help someone. It's not always about defining someone as the next active shooter. What it is, though, is defining, hey, if my employee is going through some type of struggle, we all have done that. How can I help them? How can I best help my employee to get through this particular problem they're having? Do I need to offer up some counseling? Do they need some time off? Do they, whatever that is, it's not always about defining this is the next active shooter, but it's also about helping that individual. Number 6 is a big one. Suicidal comments about putting things in order. That to me is a huge indicator. That almost, in particularly the way that it's phrased, that I just said it, that almost by itself would escalate things. There are individuals that are suicidal and not homicidal. However, I can also tell you from my experience that there's a fine line between that some people may start out feeling suicidal. And again, I am not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm always speaking from my over 2 decades in law enforcement and in investigations, is the people that I've interviewed, talked to, the scenes that I've worked. There is a fine line between suicidal and homicidal. And people can go from one right into the other. And sometimes it doesn't take much. Sometimes the person is just so depressed that they're just going to mind their own business and have those thoughts. But if somebody comes forward and says, look, I'm thinking about doing X, Y, Z, and I'm going to make sure I get some things in order and put some things in order before that happens. Pay very close attention to that. Number 7, behavior which is suspect of paranoia. For instance, everybody is against me. Everybody's watching me. I'm going to go back to the mental health issue. There are some individuals that struggle with that based on a certain diagnosis. Doesn't mean they're going to come in and cause the problems, cause the shootings. No, but it is a concern that, mixed with some of these other ones I've already spoken about, you could escalate this to a higher level in your organization and say, look, we've got to get this person help, or we need to examine what's going on here. Number 8, increasingly talks of problems at home. Again, in and of itself, we all have had struggles with home, and we've all heard the phrase, leave work at work, don't bring it home. Well, that's sometimes not easy to do. Sometimes people just want to talk and they want to get it, they want to get it out. Maybe the person that they feel closest to talking to is at your work. But again, attach that particular phrase with some other things. Number 9, escalation of domestic problems into the workplace, or talk of severe financial problems. This is another, alone by itself, could be an indicator. There have been multiple cases when investigators have gone back and looked at this person's history, and they have discovered those 2 things in particular. There has been either some form of domestic problems, a divorce, separation, what have you, abuse, and or heavy financial strain. Sometimes it's by itself, sometimes it's together, but it has been proven that in many cases from these suspects that have gone in and shot up a work environment, those 2 are very relevant things that have been discovered in a post-investigation. Number 10, talk of previous incidents of violence. Now we're pushing into where people begin to obsess and study violence. Unfortunately, a lot of the active shooters, even the ones that have been arrested by police that haven't died as a result of gunfire exchange with the police, have openly admitted that they have studied other active shooter events. Now, here's what I'll say about this, and I have a theory. My theory is that, at least from the way I view and watch, and still to this day, even though I retired, I still study these events. And one of the things I'm noticing is that some of the ways in which the aggressor attacks are different. There's some new strategies. Take, for instance, the very recent situation happened at a church, Lakewood Church, in Houston, Texas. The shooter, and thankfully the off-duty officers that were working there took care of the situation, but the shooter walked straight in and had their, I believe the boy was 7 years old, right next to her. Now, is that a coincidence? Is that she brought her boy with her, hoping that somebody would not shoot because the boy's next to her? I don't know, and we'll probably never know. But some of these different things that you begin to notice, I'll give you another example. This was probably, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago. It was at a church in California, where during a prayer meeting, the suspect walked in, and not only did he work on manipulating the locks, but he took super glue and glued the keyhole so that nobody responding could stick a key in the door to unlock it. Again, that's a different style of strategy. So these aggressors are beginning to study events and figuring out ways to make it more difficult for police to get in and help those that are trying to secure themselves during the event. Number 11, empathy with individuals committing violence. That goes back to number 10 of studying people that have committed violence previously. There's plenty of information out there for someone to study and to say, hey, they messed up here. I'm not going to do that when I commit my particular set of violence. There's a lot of information out there for them to study. And finally, number 12, increase in unsolicited comments about firearms or other dangerous weapons and violent crimes. Now, this does not refer to those individuals who collect firearms, who like to shoot, who like to go to gun shows. That's not what this is referring to. This is referring to someone who engages and places firearms in a position of violence on purpose. Obsessive study of what a certain weapon could do to a human being. Things like that. Obsession in taking a case study, a particular incident, and saying, well, maybe they should have used this gun because it would have done this or that. And just comments that would make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Again, this is not referring to people that enjoy firearms or just hobbyists. This is someone who's really associating violence with particular firearms and what it could do. So the final thing I want to show you and talk to you about is what's called a risk rubric. And what this does is, this was put out by CISA. CISA is a federal agency under the Department of Homeland Security. And we're gonna show you this and put it up on the screen. And this is a way to gauge behaviors. So remember, I told you at the beginning, you have to have two avenues. You have to have one avenue where you are educating your employees, and then the other avenue is you have to give them a way to be able to either report a problem, and then you have to be able to evaluate that problem and even gauge it, put it at some type of threat level. And that's exactly what this risk rubric does. When I have taught our surviving environment courses, I have had numerous organizations ask me to send that to them, because it is a very easy way to look and gauge when somebody exhibits a certain behavior. It may be at a low level at one point, and then they add another behavior to it, and then it jumps up. Well, what that does is that escalation allows you to now say, hey, we need to bring you in, and we need to really sit down and either bring discipline, maybe even terminate the person, or like I said earlier, about maybe just getting them some help. I do encourage you, if you want to use something like this, or if you want to create something like this, please make sure you involve your legal team, because they need to have a say in exactly how this escalation is going to work, and that way the organization stays in a real solid a real solid platform in case they do have to terminate someone over certain behaviors. So that's all I have for you right now. I hope it was very interesting to you. I hope you found it helpful. Again, this was indicators of potential violence in the workplace based on certain behaviors that an employee might be demonstrating to either one person or multiple people. And please understand this. This takes work. This is worth sitting down with your strategy team, your safety team, your leadership team, whoever it may be, and coming up with a way to educate your employees and to also make sure you have a system in place to where you can allow your employees to make these reports. Thank you for joining us on the APB Think Safe podcast, and I'll see you next time.